Genshin Impact is a wondrous game. With an ever-growing world and stylish art design, it's able to capture the imagination of players. Whether you enjoy the world, story, gameplay, one aspect that will keep players coming back to the game are the amazing characters in Genshin Impact. So, I'm Darcblade with a character guide to Raiden Shogun in Genshin Impact. In this guide we will briefly cover the basic lore of the character, their moves, abilities, weapon options, stat priorities and artifact builds. Remember though that these guides are aimed for free to play and low spender players, so they will feature characters as if they were Constellation level 0 with 4-star weaponry and such. Raiden Shogun in Genshin Impact is a 5-star electro polearm character. Unfortunately, the only way to get a hold of Raiden Shogun is through the gacha system through limited time banners. However, she has many identities, whether you refer to as Raiden Shogun, Bao or A, which all of these names have relevance when you go through Raiden Shogun's Archon storyline. She is nonetheless the Electro Archon. Thus, she is a member of the Seven and is akin to a god. Her story is very complex, but the Electro deity controls the nation of Inazuma, who has promised the people of the land an unchanging eternity. Her methods though of achieving this eternity are very questionable indeed. As you play through the story, you soon realise that she is a misunderstood Archon whose multiple identities are struggling with one another to both preserve Inazuma whilst at the same time being very questionable. For those of you who do not mind spoilers, Raiden Shogun has a dual personality. A is her true identity, and the Shogun is a puppet created by A to act as the ruler of Inazuma. The puppet continues to rule the land whilst A meditates in the plane of Euphemia. But through outside corruption, things are not going how A originally planned. This is where the Traveller comes into play, and through their help as well as their friends, are able to help put things right again. But every character in Genshin Impact has access to various talents, both combat and passive talents. Combat talents are your moves, while passives are mechanics that work in the background of a character. So first of all, the combat talents available to the Raiden Shogun. So the first combat talent is your normal attacks known as Origin. By pressing the attack button, you perform up to 5 consecutive strikes with your polearm. Alternatively, you can hold down the attack button to perform a charged attack version, which consumes a small amount of stamina to perform an upward slash, or alternatively you can press the attack button whilst in mid-air to perform a plunge and attack, which will cause the Raiden Shogun to plummet to the ground, landing with an AoE impact, damaging anyone around the impact zone. Which brings us on to the Raiden Shogun's elemental skill combat talent, known as Transcendence, Baleful, OMEN. When activating your elemental skill, the Raiden Shogun unveils a shard of her Euphemia. This deals electro damage to nearby opponents and granting all nearby party members the Eye of Stormy Judgment, indicated by a purple eye appearing above their head. Eye of Stormy Judgment has multiple effects which persist after you've used your elemental skill. Basically, when your party has the Eye of Stormy Judgment, attacks that deal damage to opponents will cause the eye to unleash a coordinated attack, dealing AoE electro damage to opponents in the position of that attack. So basically, when you attack an opponent, the Eye of Stormy Judgment will follow up that attack with a secondary attack, dealing AoE electro damage to opponents. On top of this secondary attack, characters who gain the Eye of Stormy Judgment will have their elemental burst damage increase based on the energy cost of their elemental burst during the Eye's duration. What this means is basically everyone gets a damage increase to their elemental burst, except for the Raiden Shogun unless you're playing co-op, but we'll talk about that more in a moment. And this elemental burst damage bonus is substantially more the larger the cost of your elemental burst. So say a character has an elemental burst cost of 40, the damage increase is not going to be as significant as someone who had an elemental burst cost of 80. Finally, the Eye of Stormy Judgment can only perform one coordinated attack every 0.9 seconds per party. The coordinated attacks generated by characters not controlled by the player also deal 20% of their normal damage. This applies for if you're playing in co-op. So it's a great skill that allows the Raiden Shogun to continue to contribute to a battle even if she's not on the field. Obviously, because it is electro attacks as well, it means that it can easily set up electro based elemental reaction combos. So keep this in mind when you're setting up your party. Which brings us on to the Raiden Shogun's elemental burst, known as the secret art, MUSOU, SHINSETSU. Now this is quite a complex elemental burst, and can be divided into 2 parts. You have the MUSOU Isshin and Chakra Desiderata. First of all, the MUSOU Isshin Basically, when activating your elemental burst, the Raiden Shogun will unsheathe the MUSOU no Hitatachi, which deals huge AoE electro damage in the unsheathing process. Afterwards, she will no longer use her polearm for her normal attacks. Instead, she will be using the MUSOU no Hitatachi, basically converting her polearm attacks into electro sword attacks. So her normal charged and plunging attacks will all be different and infused with electro damage that cannot be overwritten. Additionally, when she hits an opponent whilst in this state, she will regenerate energy for all nearby party members. Energy can be restored this way once every 1 second, and the effect can be triggered up to 5 times throughout the skill's duration. Whilst in this state, the Raiden Shogun's resistance to interruptions are also increased, and she is completely immune to electro charged reaction damage. And then finally, when in this state, basically all the attacks performed are considered elemental burst damage, so benefit from artifacts such as the Noblesse Oblige and more. However, the MUSOU Inshin effect will eventually wear off after a set amount of time, or alternatively if you switch her out to another character. Obviously remember, as all of your attacks whilst in this state are considered electro attacks, be mindful of the elemental reactions that you can utilize when using the Raiden Shogun's elemental burst. But that brings us on to the second part of her elemental burst, which is the Chakra Desiderata. Basically, when nearby party members, excluding herself, use elemental bursts, or, thanks to her passives, elemental skills, the Raiden Shogun will build up resolve stacks based on the energy cost of those elemental bursts. The maximum number of resolve stacks is 60. This is indicated via a purple circle of stones surrounding whatever character is active. The resolve gained by the chakra will be cleared after 300 seconds after Raiden Shogun leaves the field as well. But why are we worried about the Chakra Desiderata? Well, basically, there are certain thresholds of the chakra circle. As you build up resolve points and reach each of the various thresholds, potentially maxing out the circle, it will increase the overall damage of the MUSOU Ishin. And when the chakra is full, it will allow the Raiden Shogun's burst damage to be severely enhanced. So it's always best to save up the Raiden Shogun's elemental burst till you've built up a number of resolve points before unleashing it. This way you can get the maximum damage out of A's burst and bring down opponents quickly. That's not to say that you can't use her burst when you don't have full chakra. The damage of it will just be weaker, but sometimes you need to use the burst whenever you have it available, depending on the situation. But anyway, moving away from the combat talents to talk about the passive talents. First of all is Wishes Unnumbered. Basically, when the party member gains elemental orbs or particles from their elemental abilities, the Chakra Desiderata gains 2 resolve stacks. This effect can occur once every 3 seconds. So this is a way to build up chakra points that don't rely on characters using their elemental bursts. The next passive talent is Enlightened One. For each percentage above 100% energy recharge that the Raiden Shogun possesses, grants her 0.6 greater energy restoration from her MUSOU Ishin, and on top of that you'll also gain 0.4 electro damage bonus as well. So the more energy recharge you have, the more electro damage bonus you get, and more energy restoration you get from your elemental burst as well. And then finally, her last passive talent is Ore Preserver. This basically decreases by 50% the Mora expenditure when ascending swords and polearms. So she's great for when it comes to leveling up those specific weapon types. So those are all the passive talents available to the Raiden Shogun. But before we move on, I want to quickly mention the constellations. Obviously these guides are aimed at characters who are Constellation 0, but sometimes you get lucky. And when it comes to the Raiden Shogun, if you are able to get to Constellation Level 2, which is known as Steelbreaker, it allows the Raiden Shogun's Elemental Burst to ignore 60% of an opponent's defense, allowing her to deal even more damage. But those are all the basics of the Raiden Shogun. Let's move on to the next section where we talk about the builds that I like to use for the character. Now the Raiden Shogun can be built in multiple ways, however there is a clear build that stands above the others, which is the SUB-DPS build. This build utilizes her natural talents to provide support to a team, and when the situation calls for it, she's able to take the field and deal a lot of damage to opponents. In a way, I like to describe this build as an anchor build, which basically refers to her as being the last character in your team, and thus the one that you're going to fall back on when you're in trouble and you may lose a battle. She may be less active than, say, some of the other characters like your main DPS, but being the anchor of a team, she's going to be there for you when you most need it. This is all thanks to how her mechanics work, especially in regards to her elemental skill and especially her elemental burst. But anyway, what are the weaponry we want to look at with this build? Well, firstly, obviously 5-star weaponry is going to be the best, but if you don't have access to it, as these videos are focusing on 4-star weaponry, I'd first recommend going for the free-to-play catch, which you get by fishing. Basically, the catch is an energy recharge polearm that grants us increased elemental burst damage and elemental burst critical rate as well. All three of these stats, the elemental recharge, elemental burst damage and elemental burst critical rate, benefit the playstyle of the Raiden Shogun, and it is perfect for the character. Alternatively, if you had the battle pass, you could use something like deathmatch, which would give you crit rate as well as an attack increase depending on the number of enemies who are nearby, or alternatively you could take either the Favonius Lance or prototype Star Glitter if you're on a budget, which both also have energy recharge on them. But the artifacts are where the build comes to light, and with this build you'll want to go for the 4-piece Emblem of Severed Fate. Now this is a perfect artifact set for the Raiden Shogun, as for wearing 2 pieces of the artifact set it will grant you an energy recharge bonus of 20%. On top of that, for wearing 4 pieces of the set, it will increase your elemental burst damage by 25% of your energy recharge, up to a maximum of 75% bonus damage. Obviously you'll have one off piece, which can be filled in with what you have available to you. When it comes to your sands, you'll want to go for energy recharge, unless you already have a high energy recharge rating. If you're going well over above 200%, you can instead go for an attack percentage sands. When it comes to your goblet, you'll want to go for electro damage goblet, and then finally for your circlet, you'll want to go for either crit rate or crit damage depending on your substats. As for the substats, you'll want to focus on crit rate and crit damage, energy recharge, and then attack percentage. As for your talent priority, you'll want to max out the Secret Art MUSOU SHINSETSU first, which is your elemental burst, followed by the Transcendence BALEFUL OMEN, which is your elemental skill, and then finally your normal attacks last. This build basically enhances every aspect of the Raiden Shogun, allowing her to provide amazing support damage for a team, enhance everyone's recharge speed, elemental burst damage, and of course when the time comes, enhance her own burst damage as well. Now normally I would talk about other builds here, but in all honesty this is pretty much the be all and end all build you'd want to go for with the Raiden Shogun. Yes, there are other builds out there, but they are very subpar in comparison. But an alternative sub-DPS build could be as follows. First of all, when it comes to the weaponry, again you'll want to go for the same weapons we featured in the first build, so you'll want to focus on the catch first. Failing that, you could go for deathmatch if you have the battle pass, and failing that, you could go for the Favonius Lance or prototype Star Glitter. When it comes to the artifacts though, you have a few options to play around with. You could go for 2 pieces of the Emblem of Severed Fate combined with 2 pieces of either the Thunder and Fury set or Noblesse Oblige set, depending how you like to play, or what you have available to you. 2 pieces of the Thunder and Fury set will increase our electro damage by 15%, which will enhance both our elemental skill and our elemental burst, or alternatively, when going for 2 pieces of the Noblesse Oblige, it will increase our elemental burst damage. The choice, as always, is up to you. Once again, when it comes to the stats on these, when it comes to your sands, you'll want to go for energy recharge or attack percentage. You'll then want electro damage on your goblet, and for your circlet, you'll want to go for crit rate or crit damage. Failing that, you can also go for attack boost or energy recharge. As for the substats, you'll want to focus on crit rate and crit damage, then energy recharge, and then finally attack percentage. Once again, the talent priorities remain the same as well, so you'll want to go for your elemental burst first, followed by your elemental skill, and then your normal attacks. This alternative sub-DPS build is okay, especially if you're going through the game still and working your way through the story, and you haven't got a good artifact set when it comes to the Emblem of Severed Fates. Now there are a few other builds you could consider. There is a physical Raiden Shogun build out there, but to be honest, after testing it, it did fail in comparison to the builds featured here, so I would not recommend it. But if you are going through the game for the first time, you don't have access to a large number of high tier artifacts, then I'd recommend going for the Exile set if you're looking for a beginner set. The Exile set will give us energy recharge for wearing 2 pieces of it, and for wearing 4 pieces it will allow our elemental burst to regenerate 2 energy for all party members every 2 seconds for 6 seconds. So it's a nice little beginner support artifact set there. So those are all the builds I'd recommend for the Raiden Shogun. Obviously there may be more builds in the future as we get more artifact sets, and of course Rarity 5 weapons can change things up as well. But if there are any major and dramatic changes, I'll be sure to release an updated video. But every character in Genshin Impact has various pros and cons. When it comes to the Raiden Shogun, her first major pro is that she is an amazing support character. The way her elemental skill and elemental burst works means that she can provide increased energy recharge for her and her companions. She can increase the burst damage of her allies too, thanks to the Eye of Stormy Judgment, and even more with the right artifacts. Her next pro is that she can deal massive amounts of electro damage. This applies to her elemental skill, but mostly her elemental burst. Her elemental burst, when used correctly, allows her to hit incredibly hard, and this allows you a brief period afterwards of almost unsurpassed electro damage. And then finally, her last pro is that her elemental skill persists while she's off field. This is always a positive when it comes to support characters. Being able to contribute to the fight even though you're not the active character is always a positive, and the Raiden Shogun's Baleful OMEN does this quite effectively. But unfortunately there are cons to every single character in the game. The two cons for the Raiden Shogun include that her skills may not work well with certain characters. Now what I mean by this is that when it comes to pyro melee characters, the elemental reaction, pyro combined with electro, causes the overload elemental reaction, which can blast smaller opponents away, knocking them out of melee range, which can be slightly frustrating for melee characters. And the other con, which is really only a minor one, is that unfortunately she cannot cook. Not a big issue, but still a con nonetheless. But when it comes to A, her pros more than outshine her cons. Which brings us on to briefly talk about her team compositions. Now like I've mentioned, I like to use her as an anchor character, a character that holds up everyone else. And in all honesty, she can work well in pretty much any team, as I normally use her in more of a support role than a main DPS role. Although she can still main DPS, she is not really limited to who she can work with, the only exception being melee pyro characters, especially main DPS melee pyro characters, as when it comes to the elemental reaction, you're always knocking away the weaker, smaller foes. This doesn't happen with bosses or bigger foes, but something you have to be aware of nonetheless. And so when it comes to pyro characters, if I'm coupling them with Raiden Shogun, I'll make sure they're ranged pyro characters over melee ones. Apart from that, I'd recommend her working with cryo characters, especially cryo characters who can make use of dealing physical damage, as the cryo and electro elemental reaction, superconduct, makes enemies more susceptible to physical damage. And I'd also recommend taking other characters that can buff the Raiden Shogun, such as Bennett, Zhongli or Mona, to enhance her elemental burst, allowing it to deal even more damage. Overall, Raiden Shogun, Bao, A, whatever you like to call her, is a very powerful character. Also, when compared to some of the other Archons in the game, she is more damage focused while still being able to provide support. Her support also focuses more on dealing damage to opponents, which makes her incredibly useful. I still believe she is a wonderful character who I love to describe as an anchor, as whether you're dominating in the abyss or struggling, she can help carry you through to the end. So there we have it, that is my character guide and overview to the Raiden Shogun in Genshin Impact. Now remember, there are multiple ways to play characters in the game, which is one of the many aspects why Genshin Impact is so enjoyable for me. So at the end of the day, use the characters how you want to use. These builds are how I personally like to use the characters, and I just hope they help you out in your adventures. So until next time, I've been Darcblade, bringing you a character guide to the Raiden Shogun in Genshin Impact. Hope you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching, subscribe and like for more.